All right, so we are going to start our module off by talking about caskets, as was introduced in our discussion the other day in our first class session. So, with caskets, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do as we go through this module is take a second and think to yourself, what is a casket? All of you know what a casket is innately. Maybe you're working in funeral homes. You may even be thinking, Sarah, this is kind of a silly question. But can you define a casket for me? One of the things I do as an instructor a lot is I'm pretty down to the basics with the way I instruct. So I really go back to things that are super simple. Terms that we think we know, I'll ask you often to define for me or to think about how you would define them. And sometimes in that, we realize that we don't necessarily know as much as we think we know. So we kind of strip away that thought process and rebuild from there. So how would you define a casket? Obviously, we can't have a discussion about that right now, but keep that in mind as we go forward. There are two different definitions that in particular you're going to be responsible for, and I have both of them listed up here. As you're aware at this point, throughout your academic careers in mortuary school, you are literally going to be presented with thousands of definitions. It's a lot to ask of you to know all of those by the end, but you should have some familiarity with those terms either way. Even if you can't memorize the whole definition, you should be able to have a general understanding of all of those terms. One of the suggestions I have is using this as an example up here. This is the ABFSE, or the American Board of Funeral Service Education definition of a casket. It's a pretty wordy definition, as you can see here. It would be silly of me to try to get you to remember that entire definition. So what I've done and what I would suggest you do throughout this course, as well as other courses, is focus and hone in on a few words or a key statement within that definition. Most of these words here are just that, kind of filler, but there's a few things that really identify what the true definition is. So the American Board defines a casket as it's written here. I've highlighted some of the key terms. If you read this whole definition, I came up to the conclusion that really it's just describing a box, which really is arguably all a casket is. But what makes that box a casket is the placement or the intention to place a human remains into that box. And that's why I highlighted these terms here. Human remains, and of course, a dead human body is placed. The FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, which we will discuss at length throughout your time at North Shore, has a slightly different definition. It's a little shorter, but somewhat similar. And I, too, highlighted some of the key words here. The reason this is an important definition is later on in some future modules, we will discuss how this definition is different than the FTC's depiction of an alternative container. And if you're not familiar with that yet, that's okay. So there's similar definitions, but there are some slight variations. I want you to make a note as you go through and study on your own time how these two definitions may differ. And as we switch to the next slide, I also want you to start thinking about what types of caskets are out there. It's a blanket definition, and there's a lot that falls underneath that we're going to cover. Before we get into the details of a casket, we want to first start off the module by talking about what's the difference between a coffin and a casket. And I always laugh, having been in this profession for quite a long time, when the general public talks about what we do or references funeral service, they will oftentimes use the term coffin. And I know some funeral directors who get really upset about that, and they feel an immediate need to educate their community on the difference. I don't necessarily suggest that. They don't mean it with any ill intent. It's just people don't know what they don't know, and that's okay. So these two words are often used synonymously, as you may be aware, but there are some structural differences that you need to understand and that you can be tested on in this course. The main difference, most simply put, is just the shape of the container. So a coffin is going to have 6 sides, and a casket is going to have 4 sides. And we can go into further detail to say that a coffin is something called anthropoidal in shape. And you should have been hopefully introduced to that word when you were covering history of funeral service, because when the Egyptians built their sarcophagi, those were also described as anthropoidal in shape, and that just means wider at the shoulders than it is at the foot end. In your textbook, it goes into some further detail about why this style of container is not used in the United States, even though it is widely used in other parts of the world. So as you go through your readings and you take your individual notes, I would just jot down some reasons that you see for that and why it is customary in the United States that we use these bad boys up here versus coffins that are down here. We'll go into the next segment shortly, which will be more about the materials, common materials in mainstream casket manufacturing that we tend to see.